Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to draw a pug in pastels. Now the first step is I like to use a black Carbothello just to map in the outside shape of the eye and the eyelid area. This means that I can then focus on the accuracy of the shape and size so that I know I've got the expression right. Once I've done that, I can then begin working on the iris. Now if there are any bright highlights, I will usually use a white pencil first to make sure that I've got that as bright as I can possibly have it before I start working with any colour. However, because the downward angle of her face, we didn't really have any bright highlights here, so I was able to go in with a fairly dark base foundation first. I can then add my subtle reflections on top. Now the way that the highlights and shadows are placed are very important, and that of course is going to vary depending on the surroundings and the way that the head is positioned and the angle in which they're looking. So all of this needs to be taken into account. Now once I've got that eye done, I can then start to work on the fur around it. Now I did decide to use just my pastel pencils for this entire project so that I can focus on capturing the accuracy of the lights and the darks, just because of the way that the creases are on the fur on the top of the head, and this being a little bit more of a smaller portrait, using the pencils enables me to be really precise at each stage. Now of course you can use pan pastels for this. I would recommend to use a smaller eye makeup applicator to make sure that you've got your lights and your darks in the right place to start with. But here I really do like working with a combination of approaches to show that you don't need all of the pastel supplies in order to create realistic drawings. You can use just the pencils on their own and still get something that's highly detailed and very realistic. Now my main priority when drawing the fur here is to maximise as much depth as I possibly can. Now the starting point here is getting a good base foundation, because the softness in the base foundation, the accuracy of where the lights and the darks are positioned, is going to impact the details that are put on top. Now when I begin building up my details, I don't jump to my brightest highlight first. I really want to be building up my values in stages. Now when I am working with my pencils, I'm focusing on three main factors: the fur length, the fur thickness and fur direction. Now all of these three things are going to be very unique and varied from one animal to the next, so I want to be making sure that I'm studying that reference photo as closely as possible. Now when I'm working on fur that has a combination of light and dark layers like this, I really want to be making sure that I'm using the right layering process. If the lights and the darks are added at the wrong stage, then the layers are going to get muddy. Now when the layers of pastel mix together, it can create a very dull effect, which can actually be difficult to then fix. So making sure that I'm using the right layering process first is always, again, one of those top considerations. Now regarding how dark the base foundation needs to be, this is something that can make or break a portrait. So for example, when drawing breeds such as Pugs or Bulldogs that do have these creases in the centre of their face, if those areas are not dark enough, the folds of skin are not going to look as realistic. So this is where contrast becomes very important. Now drawing the creases is a great example of why contrast is so important. If this darker section here was too light, then it won't make it look like it's creased up in the same way. So the skin would therefore look flatter. So being able to focus on good contrast here is what makes that portrait more three-dimensional. Now a great exercise for focusing on improving the contrast in our pastel drawings is to work in grayscale. So if we just created a black and white drawing, only focusing on the values that we see, that's going to really help for colour-based portraits. Because if that was the colour was the one thing that made an artwork look realistic, then grayscale mediums like charcoal, graphite or black and white drawings in pastels, acrylics, those wouldn't look realistic, which couldn't be further from the truth. Black and white drawings can just look like black and white photographs if the values are right. So this is why contrast plays such an important role in every single one of my drawings. Now as I start to put in more of my lighter details, you can really see why the importance of focusing on a darker base foundation has made those lighter details have more impact. Now if you are putting in your highlights and you don't feel they're as bright as they should be, then that could be an indication that your base layer isn't dark enough. Now if that base foundation is too light, then your lighter pencils are not going to show up. Then what happens is we start to pick even lighter pencils and then everything ends up too bright. The contrast then gets flatter, and it's something then where the portrait will not look as realistic. So one of the ways to fix that is to just come back in, add in a few more of those darker layers, and then go back with that lighter pencil, and that should fix that problem. Now the other issue could be that the tooth of the paper has been filled. Now when the tooth of the paper has been filled, that's where the base layer foundations have had too much pastel applied, and then when the pencils are put over the top, they just glide over the surface. They've got none of that textured paper to grip to. So the pencil strokes therefore just don't show up at all. Now if that happens, you can try to remove some of that pastel, or you can use a workable fixative over the top. Now I personally don't like to use fixatives. I would much rather work with more of a cautious layering approach and build it up in stages as I am here, to make sure that I've always got plenty of tooth of paper to use. But a workable fixative, if you're this far into a portrait and you don't want to start again, then a workable fixative would be a good in-between approach. Now the reason I say about doing the fixative as an in-between stage is because if they're used as a final fixative, I personally have found that they darken the pastel significantly, and they can also make the colours look a little bit different as well, which is why I just don't like using them. But if we haven't finished with a project and we are going to be adding more pastel on top, we can correct the adjustments that the fixatives have made. So if you do need to use a fixative just to establish more tooth back to that paper, then it does work quite well. Now when using a fixative, there are a couple of things that I would recommend to do just to make them a bit easier to use. Now the first thing is I would advise to put them in a fine mist spray bottle, because the larger droplets that land on the paper can dry as a darker spot, and that would mean that they need to be reworked, and if that lands on a background, that can be a little bit more frustrating. Whereas within a fine mist spray bottle, that's less likely to happen. Now the other is to use a fixative in lighter layers rather than one heavier layer. Now if you do one light misting of a fixative, let that dry, and then you needed to do another light layer, that's going to cause less problems that a fixative can create compared to one heavy layer. Now I have previously used a fixative and a little bit too much was used, and it's almost like the details just dissolved, they vanished. I ended up having to throw the artwork away, which was obviously a real shame because of the amount of hours and work that goes into it. Now because of that one experience that I've had, I just don't like taking the risk, and that's why I don't use them in my work. But as I've mentioned, as a workable fixative, it could be that good in-between resolution if the tooth of the paper has been filled. Now if you do have any questions about fixatives or anything art related, then feel free to pop them in the comments below, because I'm more than happy to help if I can. Now working on more of the face here, you can really see now how the fur direction is so important. The fur direction isn't random, it follows the underlying bone and muscular structure. But the placements of the highlights and shadows also follow those structures. Now the fur here on the top of the head is a great example of that. If my lights and my darks were positioned too low down, then I'm actually going to make the forehead look quite tall. Although the actual proportions, the outside shape of the head hasn't changed, just by adjusting where the lights and the darks are can massively affect the proportions of the face. So I want to be making sure there that I have got that accurate, which is why I like to establish that at that first base foundation. Now working in smaller sections has always been my preferred approach. I like to get an area about 80 or 90% complete and then move on to the area next to it. Now this is just my personal preference. I find that I'm less likely to rush through those key stages, and it means then that I'm also more motivated. If I decided to end the drawing session at this stage and go back to it the following day, it already looks realistic. It's looking like that dog, even though only half of her face is complete. So this is something here that can make a big difference in how effective and efficient we're working. Now if you do like to work in whole individual layers, then of course that is absolutely fine, but if you do feel that you're hesitating, you're looking at the reference photo, not quite sure where you should be, then that is an indication that the area is a bit too big. So I just recommend to scale that down 1 or 2 inches if needed, and you'll probably find then that it ends up becoming more easier to approach, because we're able to just simplify that one section by focusing on one layer at a time. Now when I'm working on the fur around the nose on the muzzle area, I'm always looking at how short this needs to be compared to the fur on the face. Now there are going to be exceptions for dogs such as cockapoos, where the fur is just as long on the muzzle as the face, or it might even potentially be a little bit longer. But for breeds such as Pugs, Labradors, Springer Spaniels for example, the fur here is going to be significantly shorter than that on the face. So what I want to be focusing on is making sure that if needed, I'm only creating the impression of little dots or barely a line that's a millimetre long. It's something that's having that variation so that all of my pencil strokes don't look the same. Now, adjusting the length of the pencil strokes on the bridge of the nose here, because the Pugs have that shorter length of the bridge of the nose, everything here is going to be more exaggerated. So the fur direction would change very, very quickly in comparison to a Labrador that has a longer nose. Now on the top of the nose there, by the bridge of the nose where it meets in between the eyes, this is again another section where we might just have to do dots or potentially shading, so there's no actual details there at all. This of course again is going to vary from one photo to the next, but it is important to make sure that we are adjusting our pencil strokes. Now the thickness of the pencil strokes is going to be determined by a couple of different factors. How sharp the lead is, how much pressure we're applying to the pencil, even how we're holding and moving the pencil. Now when the fur is much shorter here, we also want to make sure that the lines are fairly thin so that they don't just look like round dots. If the pencil strokes are too thick, it's not going to have any real definition because we still want to make it look realistic. So how we're using the pencils on these smaller areas and where that fur is that much shorter, it does require more of a refined pencil technique in order to make sure that this area still has the same level of realism compared to the rest of the drawing. Now whenever I'm working on this final section where I'm starting the neck and the chest, I want to be making sure that I'm giving it the right amount of time. Now I think all of the detail and work that goes into the face, when we're fading out the neck portion of a portrait, it can be more tempting to rush this section. So I really want to be aware of that and therefore make sure that each layer is given the right amount of time for each stage. So on this area here where I start to put in my base foundation, I want to have an idea of where I'm going to start fading it out. Now when I'm working with portraits like this, I'm always focusing on making sure I've got the right balance and composition. I don't want there to just be a very small part of the neck, and I also prefer not to have a harsh start and stop point. If I can, I want to fade that into the paper colour or the background, just so that it has that softness. Now in order to do that here, you can see that I'm using a combination of blending tools. I started off there with a paintbrush, and then at times I'm also going to be using a cotton bud. But this is going to enable me to create a soft edge so that all of that focus remains on the face, but that I've also got enough of the neck included. Now adding the neck and chest portion here, this can be a little bit trickier if you're working from a photo that's been cropped or a photo like this where the head position is at more of that side angle. Now because she's sort of looking over her shoulder, this has meant that I didn't have much here to work with. So what I might do in these situations is either add a little bit more of a blended softer edge, which there you saw I'm using here. This is a round soft tool. And what that's doing here is I'm able to drag that fur out. I'm softening that fade even more, but it's helping to actually widen this part of the neck and chest area. Now I don't want to be doing this and adjusting the proportions because obviously that's then going to be different to what this dog would look like. But what I am doing here is just creating more of that softer edge, which is just giving a bit more of a better composition and balance to the piece. So this is something that I focus on at the planning stage. When I'm designing where I want the subject to be positioned, I'm also thinking about how and where I'm going to blend the edges of the chest, because otherwise this can actually be a really distracting part of the finished portrait. And then at this stage, I do just add the final adjustments, making any of my darks a little bit darker, the highlights brighter, and of course add in the whiskers. So I do hope that this video has been useful. If it was, I'd be very grateful if you could give it a like and a thumbs up. It makes a huge difference to my channel. I also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you do have any art related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments below because I'm more than happy to help if I can. And I'm going to be uploading another video at the end of the week, but as always, thank you so much for watching.